In this podcast, we begin Chapter 20, Musculoskeletal Injuries, by focusing on the anatomy and physiology of the musculoskeletal system. Now, we can focus on the skeletal part of that, the skeleton, the bones, and as long as we understand that that is basically the framework that protects our organs and allows us to move, and because it provides structure, then we add to that the connective tissue and the cartilage as part of that skeletal system. The skeleton has 7 broad areas working from head to toe: the head, the spine, the shoulder, and the clavicle, that rigid circle, if you will, at the upper part of our body. We have the rib cage. We have the pelvis, another rigid circle at the lower part of our body. The lower extremities, the legs. I mention the shoulder and the clavicle as that rigid area, and the pelvis because those become important if we need to think about carefully moving a patient. Now, at the end of bones, we find articular cartilage. Think about the word articulate. That means to move. And so that cartilage at the end of a bone provides that friction-free surface so that bones can move against one another. Think about the femur, the tibia, and the fibula moving inside your knee. Now, we do need to be careful with pediatric patients. Bones will grow as a child grows along a growth plate, which is near the end. If a patient, specifically a pediatric patient, has a fracture, we need to consider that that fracture could be damaging the growth plate. Now, specifically inside a bone, we have the cortex. And within that, the bone marrow, a region where blood cells are made. Surprisingly, bones are very, very vascular. 1/10 to 1/5 of all the blood pumped by your heart goes to a bone. If the cortex of a bone breaks, there can be some severe bleeding associated with that. All of this is surrounded by the hard outer layer. Periosteum specifically means outer bone. Now, if we think about where bones come together, that's a joint, and that enables movements. Sometimes that movement can be very free, such as a knee or a shoulder. Sometimes less so, such as the vertebrae in our back. And sometimes bones at joints can be fused. Think about the sacrum or the coccyx at the bottom of your backbone. But within those joints, we have a joint capsule. And to lubricate that movement, we have synovial fluid. As described previously, we can look at the different degrees of movement, and we can also think just a little bit more. This becomes important when we treat injuries. Our shoulder, for example, is a ball and socket joint, allowing it to move in 3 dimensions, but that's a little bit different, not shown, but if you went to an elbow, that's a hinge joint. It only moves in 1 dimension. Now we move to the idea of connective tissue in the musculoskeletal system, and we have ligaments. Ligaments join 2 bones together. They're composed of strong connective tissue, specifically, mostly a protein called elastin. Think about that, elastin. The idea of a ligament is to help limit the range of joint motion. And if you've heard of, for example, an ACL tear in a knee, what that is, the anterior cruciate ligament. Anterior means it's in the front. Cruciate means it crosses over. And it's a ligament. It's connecting the bones on either side of our knee joint, and that's going to provide some structure. It's going to limit the range of motion. When that motion gets exceeded is when an ACL tear occurs. Here's that example, and we can learn a few more anatomical terms here. We can describe the knee as a hinge joint. It's only designed to move forward and backward, anterior and posterior. It's not designed to move side to side. And so the anterior cruciate ligament is the ligament that crosses in the front. The posterior cruciate ligament is the ligament that crosses in the back posterior, right? So we can learn some anatomical terms when we just think about and put it into context. Ligaments do restrict motion in every joint by some degree. And so in a shoulder joint, we have fewer ligaments. We have much more motion. It's three-dimensional. It's a ball and socket joint. And we saw the knee in the previous slide, that hinge joint, much more limited. Ligaments will keep those bone ends close to each other and in the proper orientation. Muscle is what allows that movement to occur. We have skeletal muscle, which is long and straight, and when it shortens by contraction, we can imagine the flexion of a joint. We have smooth muscle that we might find, for example, in our intestines that can contract in such a way as to move fluids throughout our body. And cardiac muscle is its own special type. We'll talk more about that when we focus on cardiac emergencies and CPR. Contraction and relaxation is where we get the movement that's important for us. That is due to chemical and electrical signals that travel from a brain to a nerve that triggers that particular flexion. One of the things that we assess when we look at a musculoskeletal injury is whether or not that motion and that sensation from that particular nerve is still intact. All of the muscle systems that we think about in the skeletal muscular system are paired. So I may flex my arm with my biceps, I may extend it with the triceps. We would see that, for example, in the lower extremity with our quads and our hamstrings, and so on. Now, how a muscle is particularly attached to a long bone is through a tendon. Tendons are also essentially long chain proteins. In this case, it's principally collagen, and they can be damaged by stretching or tearing. And the name of that particular injury is a rupture. Now, after an injury, the musculoskeletal system can heal itself, but the ability to do so depends on several factors. When a bone breaks, that injury is called a fracture. We may have a hematoma or an internal bruise that's forming around the fracture site, and eventually callus, which is essentially a protein matrix, forms at the site of that fracture, with calcium eventually deposited onto that matrix and new bone forming. It's essential that all of those nutrients are there in terms of constructing that new protein matrix. And so immobilization, think about placing a cast on a broken bone, is important to promote bone healing. Now, muscle can heal, but it heals a little bit more slowly. Ligaments likewise will heal, but one thing that's important in the difference here is we do not get the deposition of calcium into that protein matrix. Think about it, muscles, ligaments, and so on are not going to be hard tissues like a bone. They need to stay pliable because they're associated with movement. Tendons, connected at one end to bone and at the other end to muscle, need to be protected during the healing process. Cartilage, which we find protecting joints between bones, does not heal very well because the blood supply is so poor. This is a quick introduction to musculoskeletal injuries and the anatomy that we find. One thing that is important is to associate types of musculoskeletal tissue with the particular injury that might occur. So for a bone, it's a fracture. For muscle tissue, it's a strain. For a ligament, it's a sprain. For a tendon, it's a rupture. For a joint, we can have a dislocation. And we'll look at these injuries in more detail.